Today, we're going to deconstruct one of the most complex and frankly disturbing stories of our time. It's a saga filled with immense power, global influence, and a whole lot of secrets. Our goal here is to map out exactly how the Epstein network actually operated.
So where does a story this massive even begin? Well, it starts with a single object. When Jeffrey Epstein's butler, a man named Alfredo Rodriguez, tried to sell his boss's personal contact book, he called it the Holy Grail. And you know what? He was right. This wasn't just some list of names. It was the blueprint for a hidden world of incredible power.
All right, to really get our heads around this sprawling network, we have to break it down piece by piece. We'll start with that infamous Black Book. Then, we'll look at the man at the center of it all and his chief operator. From there, we'll trace the system of abuse, look at the plea deal that just shocked the world, and finally, get into the mysterious end that left so many questions unanswered.
Okay, so let's start with the book itself. We're talking about a 97-page personal contact book. It first really came to light when Epstein's butler tried to sell it to lawyers who were representing victims. He called it his insurance because he was apparently afraid that his boss wanted him to disappear.
And what was inside? Well, the numbers are just staggering. 1,571 names with nearly 5,000 phone numbers. This was no ordinary address book. It was a directory that connected Epstein to a who's who of the global elite. Princes, politicians, celebrities, oligarchs. It was literally the directory to a shadow world.
So we have the book. Now let's turn to the man at the center of this web, Jeffrey Epstein. To really grasp his influence, you first have to understand the myth that he so carefully built around himself. See, he wasn't just seen as a rich guy. He was projected as this intellectual powerhouse.
And the story that was told about him was remarkably consistent. People in the circle and even the media, they often described him in almost superhuman terms. He was called brilliant, someone who was just great at finding things out, who could see patterns that nobody else could. And he cultivated this image by, for example, hosting these dinner parties for world-famous scientists, branding himself as some kind of avant-garde intellectual. This myth of genius, it was absolutely crucial. It gave him access and a veneer of legitimacy.
But what was he really like behind closed doors? Well, Stuart Pivar, who called himself Epstein's best pal, painted a very different picture. He said Epstein actually had no attention span, couldn't follow a conversation for more than a couple of minutes, and would just derail these serious discussions with really crude, bizarre remarks. The genius, it seems, was just a performance. Okay, so if Epstein was the figurehead, then Ghislaine Maxwell, she was the engine. Nearly everyone described her as his right-hand woman, and she was the one who allegedly kept this whole operation running. So to understand the system, you really have to understand her role in it.
And this is a really crucial point. According to one victim's attorney, Maxwell wasn't just a companion, she was the manager. She allegedly handled all the logistics, from hiring recruiters and managing employees to scheduling appointments. It's also alleged she kept the ring going by intimidating the girls and making sure they stayed silent. You can see how she handled this kind of scrutiny right here, in this page from one of her depositions. When she was asked direct questions, she often gave these long, evasive answers that just kind of deflected from the main point. And this was a pattern. Even though she was in charge of hiring for 6 different homes, her memory about specific duties would suddenly become very vague under oath.
So how did it work? Well, her alleged methodology followed this chillingly effective pattern. First, she'd identify a target. Then, she'd gain their trust. One victim actually stated under oath, quote, "I trusted her because she is a woman." And that trust was the key that opened the door. Once that trust was established, she'd make the introduction to Epstein. And finally, she would work to ensure their silence.
Now, this recruitment pipeline didn't just exist in a vacuum. It fed into a fully fledged, organized system. This operation wasn't random. It was a structured network with specific locations where the abuse allegedly took place for decades. And when you look at the locations, you really start to grasp the scale of it all. This was a global operation. It stretched from a lavish mansion in Palm Beach and a huge townhouse in New York City, all the way to a sprawling ranch out in New Mexico. But of course, the 2 most infamous locations were his private Caribbean island, Little St. James, and his private Boeing 727, which earned that grim nickname, the Lolita Express.
And inside these places, a very disturbing pattern started to emerge. A household employee, Juan Alessi, testified to police that near the end of his time working there,
he noticed that the so-called masseuses, they were getting younger and younger. His testimony points to a systematic and escalating recruitment of underage victims.
So, you might be wondering, with all of this going on, how did Epstein avoid any serious consequences for so long? The answer really lies in a legal agreement from 2007 that is still one of the most controversial plea deals in American history.
It's called a non-prosecution agreement, or NPA. Now, this was a secret deal with federal prosecutors, and it contained an almost unheard-of clause. It granted sweeping immunity not just to Epstein, but to, and I quote, any potential co-conspirators. This one clause effectively shielded his entire network from federal prosecution for past crimes.
And to really understand what a huge deal that was, you have to know what federal prosecutors already had in their hands. They had drafted a 53-page indictment detailing crimes against dozens of victims. But because of that NPA, that indictment was never filed. It was just shelved.
So after all that, what was the actual punishment? Just 13 months, and that was served in a private wing of a county jail, not even a federal prison. And on top of that, he was granted work release, which allowed him to leave the jail for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week.
Now, it seemed like justice might finally be coming in 2019, when Epstein was arrested on new federal sex trafficking charges. But his story didn't end in a courtroom, it ended in a jail cell, under circumstances that have fueled intense speculation ever since.
The night he died was what the Attorney General himself called a perfect storm of screw-ups. Think about this. His cellmate was transferred out just the day before. The 2 guards assigned to his unit fell asleep for hours and later admitted to falsifying records. And, incredibly, 3 separate cameras that could have shown his cell all malfunctioned at the same time.
So, officially, the New York City medical examiner ruled the death a suicide by hanging, but a prominent pathologist hired by Epstein's brother reviewed the evidence and came to a completely different conclusion, that the injuries were actually more consistent with homicide by strangulation. And this fundamental conflict has never really been resolved.
You'd think the release of court documents would clear things up, right? Well, not exactly. While thousands of pages have been unsealed, the files are just filled with widespread redactions. With names and key details blacked out, we're all left with a puzzle that's still very incomplete. And that's really where this all leaves us, with one final lingering question. Jeffrey Epstein is dead. Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison. But with so many powerful names connected to this whole saga, and so much official information still hidden from public view, you have to ask, will the full, unvarnished truth about this network ever truly see the light of day?